Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second of the library's three-part 17th annual Alan and Nathalie Voorhees Lectures on the History of Cartography. My name is Scott Dodson. I'm the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation. I want to thank everyone who's joined us this evening, and for those of you who were able to attend our last Voorhees Lecture in August with Dr. Larry Tise, welcome back. It's a great group tonight. We had so many people register for this event, and we're very excited to have you all. I would also like to recognize the Fry-Jefferson Map Society with the Library of Virginia for its support in hosting this event. Before we begin Mr. Lawler's presentation, I have a few housekeeping notes. At the end of the program today, Mr. Lawler will answer your questions. Please feel free to type them into the chat box during the program, and we'll do our best to gather it at the end for a Q&A session. If you would like to support the library today or in the future, or join the Fry-Jefferson Society, please go to lba.virginia.gov and click the Support the Library link. We'll post the direct link in the chat box this evening as well. And we very much appreciate considering supporting us. And now on to the program. Tonight's lecture is titled Uncharted Territory, How Maps Launched and Nearly Sank English Colonization of the New World. Andrew Lawler is the author of the best-selling book, The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. He has also written on more than 1,000 newspaper and magazine articles, appearing in the New York Times, Washington Post, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and many others. This presentation will focus on the late 16th century, where England lagged far behind other European powers, such as Spain and Portugal, in knowing what was where in the New World. If you have not already purchased Mr. Lawler's most recent book, it is available through the Virginia shop with the Library of Virginia. Just visit www.thevirginiashop.org, and we'll also provide you a direct link to purchase the book as well. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you, and everyone, please enjoy the presentation.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that we all can't be physically together so I could sign your copies after the talk. But I'll do my best to give you a little bit of a walk through a not so well-known part of our history. And I'm starting really not with the English colonization, but I'm going to start with the century before. Now, as most of you probably know, Jamestown was settled in 1607, the first permanent English colony. And a century before Jamestown was settled, the New World was just coming into focus for Europeans. And this map that you see before you it's a magnificent map. There's a copy of it in the Library of Congress, and it is one of the first maps we have of the entire globe. Now, of course, Africa and Europe are familiar, and as well as Asia off to the right there. To the left, you'll see what is the kind of our first glimpse, the first European glimpse of the New World in the form of South America in green, and then up there at the top left, you'll see what is North America. Now, I want to bring your attention to a couple things. One is that obviously the cartographers in 1507, which is only, what if I can do the math, 15 or so years after Columbus, it's very rudimentary. Europeans still don't know really what's out there. They know there's something there and it's big, but they don't precisely know how big it is and how far it extends. And also there's a problem in this period because people didn't really know how to measure longitude. That is, from east to west, how far was something? The technology simply wasn't there yet. So that's part of the reason why this view that we have of the Americas is so distorted. But focus on this one particular point. If you look where South America is meeting North America, you'll see it thins down to almost an inlet that passes into the Pacific Ocean. And this is going to be a focus of what we talk about in the next few minutes. So first, I think it's very important to get it out of our heads that Europeans were trying to discover America. They weren't. They had no idea it was there. They suspected there were islands and things between them and the places they wanted to go. The place they wanted to go was China, because in 1507, the world's largest city was not London, it wasn't Paris, it wasn't Moscow, it was Beijing. Beijing was the center of a country that was incredibly wealthy, large empire that produced more manufactured goods than any place else in the world. So this is why Europeans were hot to find a way to get to the East. It wasn't to find a new world, it wasn't to explore, it wasn't to expand the horizons, it was pure economics. So problem was obviously going around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. That was rather difficult, took a long time to get to that part of the world. So of course Columbus's idea is, well, we can travel in the other direction, travel west. The globe is a globe and we can get to the other side quicker. So this is where the miracle of the Isthmus of Panama comes in. And it's something we tend not to think about or talk much about, but this is really it was kind of the fulcrum of the 16th century. And what happened was the Spanish discovered that if you sent a ship, say from Seville, which was the great port of the day, across the ocean, following the currents, and you got to Panama, you could, now it's a very difficult forest, tropical forest to work through, but you could get to the other side, to the Pacific Ocean. They learned this very, very soon. And if you see the map here on the right, you'll see that you can almost tell where the Spanish were interested, because they were focused on understanding the topography around Central America, and specifically Panama, which was the place where getting from the Atlantic to the Pacific involved the least amount of effort. And once they mastered this, the Spanish were able to essentially master the global economy, because they were able to travel not just to the New World, they were able to cut across and travel all the way to the Philippines. Now, the Philippines are important because this is where the trading entrepot was for the Spanish to meet up with Chinese merchant ships. So the Spanish didn't generally go to China. They tended to focus on the Philippines, meet up there with traders from across Asia, but particularly from China. And there they could gather the silks, the spices, all the exotic, expensive goods that they knew they could sell at quite dear prices back in Europe. So this is the economic system that is getting going very early on in the 1500s. And let's talk a bit about Spain, because if you're like me, raised in the United States and I was raised in Virginia, the history I got is mostly about the English. And it was only as I did more and more research on my last book that I realized how skewed that perspective was. And in fact, the Spanish by 1580 were the world's first global empire. By 1580, Spain had absorbed Portugal and its empire. So by that time, you had Spain controlling chunks of South America and North America, as well as large parts of Europe, including the Netherlands, and bits and pieces of Italy and other parts of Europe, as well as that critical place, the Philippines, which served as the center for the trade that was then fed back to Spain. And you'll see here an image of Seville. I love this. It's a beautiful 16th century map of the city, which at that time was where all of the ships that came from the Indies, they all had to come to Seville, because that's where the government could control what was coming and going. They could count the gold, count the silver, count the silk, count the bags of spices. So they knew precisely how much they were getting, and then it could be distributed across Europe. And part of this wealth is visible today in the form of the incredible inner city of Seville. Here's the cathedral you'll see, which originally was a mosque, because of course this was an Arabic town prior to the reconquest of the previous century. So Seville was an incredibly wealthy place because all of this wealth was being sucked into this one city and then spread across Europe. And this is a really fascinating piece of history that some of you may have heard of. I wasn't familiar with, but in 1503, they realized in Spain that the key to all of this, the key to the new global economy that they were creating and exploiting was maps. Maps for information, maps for power. If you knew how to get from A to B, that was immense raw power. And the Spanish had not just the maps, but they had the navigators, they had the record keepers, they had the ship's masters, they had this entire setup that was focused on allowing merchant ships to get from one end of the world to the other and back safely. And to do that, they required maps. So this place called the House of Trade for the Indies, it's a rather legendary place for a lot of colonial historians, because it's a place where all the important people who were powering this global machine were based. And we don't know actually too much about the details of how it ran, but we do know this, that probably in the palace, which you'll see here to the right, which you can go visit in Seville today. It's a gorgeous place. It's a former Arab palace was converted to administrative use by the Spanish. And here is where they kept this map, the Padrón Real, which was the map of maps. It was a map that was improved. So the idea was not to create a beautiful map that a collector might want to own, or a beautiful map that would impress people. This was purely about data. Every time somebody who had sailed around the world or anywhere in the world returned to Seville, they were expected to go to the House of Trade. They were expected to provide this new information about a coastline, about an island, about rocks, you name it, so that every ship that was traveling out of Seville, moving into other parts of the world, could do so safely. This was critical, because if you have a shipwreck, you've lost not just your cargo, but you've lost a crew that's experienced, you've lost navigators, and of course, you've lost this amazing piece of technology, the ship itself. So the Padrón Real was this unusual combination of, let's say, I tend to think of it almost like the nuclear codes, because it was kept under lock and key. And in fact, there's a story that there were 2 or 3 keys that were kept by different people. So every time it was taken out and improved upon, there had to be at least 2 or 3 people who would provide access to it, much like, say, a secret code today. So this gives you an idea of how important maps were in the 16th century. Probably never before and never since have maps been the real focus of power and might throughout the world. So the Spanish are playing this game of developing a global economy, bringing back massive amounts of wealth from the New World, from the Philippines and from China, other parts of Southeast Asia. They kind of have a lot of the economy locked up outside of Europe in a surprisingly short amount of time. So it was time for other European players to get in on the action. And one thing that they found, let me just pull this out of the way here so I can see. There we go. The French king, Francis I, decided it was time to get in on this, and he hired a man named Giovanni de Verrazano. You've heard of the Verrazano Bridge in New York. Well, this is why it's given that name, because he was one of the first Europeans to sail along the east coast of North America. And what did he find? Well, what he found was pretty amazing, and in fact, it helped to shape not just maps in the coming century, but it helped to create our own country, something that I didn't learn in the history books growing up, and I was surprised to discover in my research. Now, his voyage left, of course, from France. He cut across the North Atlantic, landing in, we think, and we don't know exactly because it's a little difficult to determine exactly where he was, but we do know from his description, we have a pretty good idea of where he sailed. And that is, he sailed in a place where there was an isthmus 1 mile wide and 200 miles long, in which we could see the Eastern Sea from the ship. Now, the Eastern Sea is a reference to the Pacific, or sometimes it's called the South Sea. And this was where you wanted to be, because it took you, of course, to China. So he also describes a seashore covered with fine sand, with small hills about 50 paces high, as well as friendly Native Americans who were trying to get him to come ashore. Now, this is, if any of you have ever been to the Outer Banks, it's a pretty good description. It's a long, narrow line of islands, barrier islands that are very sandy, covered in some forest, but lots of sand. And so this is a very good description of the Outer Banks. So it seems almost certain that he arrived at a place around Cape Fear and then moved north along the Carolina coast. Now, we might think it's funny, but when he was traveling north along the coast, and here you'll see a satellite image on the left that shows that you can see those little islands that stretch, the barrier islands, the Outer Banks, which stretch from the south north up to Virginia. And then there's a larger map there to give you the context. And you can see right above where the picture of the bridge is, you'll see right where the Outer Banks are. So you might say, okay, he saw an isthmus, he saw the Eastern Sea. How do you see the Pacific Ocean when you're still in the Atlantic? How absurd is that? Well, if any of you have ever been to the Outer Banks, you may have crossed the Oregon Inlet Bridge, pictured here at the bottom right. And once you're on top of that bridge, I was there just a few weeks ago, and as always, I swivel my head right and left, and you look out to the ocean. Of course, you can't see land, and you look the other direction. You look west, and you can't see land, because the Pamlico Sound, which is pictured here in the center of that satellite photo to the left, is incredibly wide, 30, 40, 50 miles wide at points. So you can't see land. So the idea that Verrazano believed he had seen the Pacific Ocean is not as crazy or as infantile as it might sound, because these are very, very wide bays, and there's no other place on the East Coast like it. So almost certainly this is where Verrazano was. So this is the big eureka moment, because Verrazano realizes that he's discovered a North American Panama. So you've got Panama in Central America that the Spanish had been making use of for decades and decades, getting very, very rich doing so. And the Europeans, and particularly the French, were hot on this idea of, wow, if we could find the Panama of North America, then we could get access to those Chinese markets and not be shut out and not have to pay the high prices we have to pay for those Spanish goods. Not to mention a way to try and control or diminish Spain's power. Spain, of course, with all that wealth, was asserting itself in Europe in the form of armies. So the French were eager to find a way both to gain new wealth as well as to try and keep Spain in check. So Verrazano, he talked about reaching the blessed shores of Cathay. This was his great goal, and he did go back. He went back to the New World in later in the 1520s, but he was killed on a beach by Native Americans, and so he didn't reach those blessed shores of Cathay. And as a result, he never was able to follow up on his discovery. But maps were made of that original voyage based on what he had said, and those maps lived on. So what's interesting here is that you come up with an idea, and even if it proves false or you don't have additional data, it kind of becomes a legend, becomes something that people accept, becomes conventional wisdom. And sure enough, this idea of a North American Panama became a kind of conventional wisdom through parts of Europe. And you'll see this map here. This is a beautiful, beautiful map that shows these ships that are riding in the Pacific Ocean, in the Southern Sea or the Eastern Sea. And there you'll see the Outer Banks at the bottom where the water is pressing against the Atlantic Ocean. You see the peninsula of Florida clearly and Cuba below. So this gives you a really good sense of the power that Verrazano's words and the maps that came out of this one brief cruise along the coast, what it created. Now, the Spanish, of course, they were no fools. They had been making maps for decades and decades and decades. They knew the New World better than anybody. They had conquered the Aztec civilization. They had conquered the Peruvians, they knew what was where. They were very savvy about geography because their entire empire depended on understanding geography. So they did think that maybe there was a chance that you could travel from the east coast of the United States across to Mexico, and maybe it would be a shorter way than having to sail through the Gulf of Mexico or down to Panama. They toyed with this idea, and in order to see if it worked, they actually sent an expedition. The Spanish had several settlements along the east coast, not just St. Augustine, Santa Elena, and others that were dotting the Florida and Georgia and possibly South Carolina coast too. And so they sent an expedition that went far into the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, close to where I'm sitting now in Asheville, North Carolina. Juan Pardo came very near to here, and he actually left the remains of a fort, which were discovered a couple of decades ago by archaeologists, that show that the Spanish were building a fort with Native American help. But what Juan Pardo was after was not so much gold or silver. He was looking for access, easier access to the silver mines in Mexico. Now, I mentioned earlier that problem with longitude. Well, this was a classic example of what happens when you can't tell how far it is to get from point A in the east to point B in the west. Once he got up into the Appalachians, he realized it was a nightmare. To try and get all the way to Mexico was simply not going to happen. Now, there's some other stories of other expeditions who did make that journey, but I won't talk about that now. The point here is that the Spanish knew as early as the 1560s that there certainly was no shortcut to get to the Pacific Ocean from the east coast of the United States. And I thought I'd throw in here this idea by a man named Alfred Korzybski. He was the founder of systems theory, a Polish intellectual who is famous for this particular quote: "The map is not the territory." And this is what the non-Spanish Europeans quickly forgot. So you see these maps here. These are variations on the theme of the map that Verrazano had promulgated. And you'll see there between just north of Florida, you'll see that little narrow isthmus again, right? With this land off to the right and then the land to the left. Again, this is the idea that there is a Panama in North America. If we can only get there, we can only control it, then we will be able to grasp the riches of the East. So this legend, it's not fact, it became a legend, lived on in the form of these maps, which were passed around Europe. And people who weren't as familiar with cartography, and that would include anybody who lived outside of Spain and Portugal in those days, might easily be taken in by this idea. So now we finally get to the English. And the English, and this is something that came as a bit of a surprise to me, raised in thinking about Queen Elizabeth I as the head of this glittering court, wealthy, intellectual, Shakespeare, you name it. I mean, who would not want to go back to Tudor England? But in reality, England in the 1580s, when Queen Elizabeth was in power, was actually a very poor cousin to France and to Spain. It was a relatively small country, not much in the way of revenues or wealth. They didn't have a single sea captain who could reliably sail to the New World and back. And that's almost a century after Columbus. So the English had fallen way behind. Now, they began at the top of their game. Well, Henry VII actually rejected Columbus's attempt to get support from him to travel to the New World. But not long after, he did support Giovanni Cabot, who unfortunately vanished on his second voyage, but did make it to the New World and possibly to Newfoundland. There's some possible evidence of a church that might have been built in Newfoundland by that expedition, but we don't have much information. And at that point, after he had gotten a few things back from from the first Cabot voyage, really not much happened. And Henry VIII, famous for his wives, was busy chasing wives rather than focusing on the New World. He was busy fighting with the Pope over the nature of his power, and ended up, of course, breaking with the Roman Church. And as a result, England was severed from much of Europe, which then was still largely Catholic, and became one of the first Protestant countries. And so what happened at that point was Queen Elizabeth I comes on the scene. Now, she was more open-minded than her father, and she believed that England needed new revenues, it needed new colonies, it needed a way to attract revenues. So she supported a guy named Frobisher, Martin Frobisher, who had an idea of traveling to Baffin Island, what is now Canada, in order to create actually possibly even a colony that would mine for gold. Now, it ended in financial disaster when it turned out that this gold was actually fool's gold. It wasn't worth anything. And a lot of it was used to pave some of the new streets of London. But unfortunately, it turned out to be a financial disaster. And that made Elizabeth and the rest of her court, who had invested, not very keen on the New World, because they lost a lot of money. Now, in 1583, a man named Humphrey Gilbert managed to get the Queen's attention and managed to launch an expedition to Newfoundland. Excuse me just a moment. I'm just going to check. Okay. All right. Sorry for that. Just turning off some sound there. Okay, so back to Humphrey Gilbert. This is a man who had an itch to be rich. Humphrey Gilbert was quite the explorer, and also somebody who wanted to get access to those riches in the East, particularly to China. And you'll see here a map that he used to try and convince the Queen that there was a passage to China through what we would call the Northwest Passage, over the top of America. Now we know today that that turns out to be a false hope, although with global warming, it may be more likely that that will become a viable route. But at the time, it wasn't, particularly with the kind of ships that they were sailing in those days. So Humphrey Gilbert made a brave attempt to sail to the New World, to Newfoundland. Things went from bad to worse, and in the end, on his way back, he ended up drowning in a small ship that he was traveling in, famously reading Shakespeare. So this was a major blow, because here was somebody who had the vision to try and get England into the game, but in the end he failed. And again, this did not endear the New World to the court of Elizabeth I, a court that had the powerful people you needed in order to get the money you needed to launch an expedition. So a new character enters the picture in the 1550s. His name was Richard Hacklett. And there are two Richard Hackletts. There's Richard Hacklett the elder, who may have been his uncle or an older relative, who has his own story, but we'll focus on Richard Hacklett the younger, because I find him to be one of the more fascinating people of the 16th century. He was a pastor, an Anglican priest, and he was also quite the bookworm. And he also helped to launch the British Empire. This is a man who produced 3 major volumes that provided and provide colonial historians with much of their information about what the English and others did in the late 1500s. Won't go into detail, but let's just say this was somebody who really believed that if England were going to find its destiny, it had to find the New World. It had to find a way to colonize and settle the New World. Part of that was also as a way to gain access to those fabled riches of the East. Now, he believed something quite fascinating. That was that the secret was in plain sight. That is, that in Westminster Palace itself, where Queen Elizabeth held court, there was a Verrazano map that marked a little neck of land. And he also knew of an old globe in the Queen's private gallery that also seemed to be from Verrazano's time, that showed this very self-straight neck of land as it doth in Panama. So here we have our northern legend of the northern isthmus of North America rearing its head again, years, decades and decades after Verrazano. So Hacklett was sent to Paris basically to spy, to get geographical information. And he became convinced that, in fact, there was this isthmus that would allow the English to dominate global trade. And he even wrote to the Secretary of State, Francis Walsingham, who was famously the first spy master of England, and insisted that our chances, we wax cold and fall to the ground if we don't act now. And you see the map that he published, it was a Michael Lock map in 1582, which shows, you can see that little gap there, which is that Panama, which is essentially the Outer Banks. Now, fortunately, the English had somebody who they almost hanged, who turned out to be of great service. His name was Simon Fernandez, and he was an Azorian pirate who worked for the Spanish, doubtless sailed to the New World many times in Spanish service, and then defected to Wales, where he was quite the rogue pirate until he was captured, jailed in London, and nearly hanged until they realized, hey, here's somebody who actually knows maps. So he was raised up, and he became the person who actually took Walter Raleigh under his wing and took him out on his first sea voyage. He also loaned a map to John Dee, John Dee was this famous, essentially the chief scientist to Queen Elizabeth. And you'll see here this map, just a portion of it shown here. It's not a pretty map that has lots of colors and pictures. This is a working man. This is a working navigator's map. This shows everything that can be known at that date about the East Coast. So, and I'm going to really move through the Lost Colony quite quickly. The Roanoke voyages, there are 4 main missions. Simon Fernandez was the navigator on the first 3. He was a key person who knew how to get the colonists there safely and to get them back. He managed to get them all there safely, and he got back. Although in 1587, when he returned to England, of course, the colonists were left behind. A search mission was sent in 1590 when John Smith, the governor, returned to the colony. The colonists had vanished. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I will dwell on the fact that that Fernandez was smart. He understood the lay of the land. And one question that I believe he wanted to answer was this: where is St. Mary's Bay? Now, the Spanish had called Chesapeake Bay, or traditionally, historians say the Spanish called Chesapeake Bay St. Mary's Bay. But in truth, in my research, I discovered that there was a lot of confusion about the Carolina Sounds and the Chesapeake Bay. If we go back to this map at the upper right, this is a map that was drawn probably by Ralph Lane, who was the head of the first colony, the 1585 colony. And he labels this as St. Mary's Bay. Now, we're on the Outer Banks now. We're about 100 miles south of Chesapeake Bay. So what gives? Well, I believe that what happened was the Spanish believed that the coast of North Carolina and the Chesapeake Bay were one. There were a series of bays, and there's only a brief bit of land you sail when you're sailing north to Virginia where there is no substantial bay. But it was a logical mistake for the Spanish to make because they weren't terribly interested in this area. They tried to settle it once, it was a disaster. So they didn't really care. But the English did care because they were looking for the right place to settle. And finally, we have the close-up. We have the truth of what the coast of North America looks like from these amazing maps done. Thomas Harriot, the scientist who was on the 1585 expedition, along with John White, who was the artist on 1585 expedition to Roanoke, and then later the governor. And you see these amazing images that you'll see to your right. Well, first focus on your left, you'll see there's no South Sea. He's not showing a South Sea. There's no isthmus that leads to China. And then to the right, you'll see this amazingly detailed and remarkably accurate map, given the technology of the day, with Roanoke as that little pink island in the center between the Outer Banks and the mainland. And if you look closely, go left and you see where the Albemarle Sound branches off into those two broad arms just west of Roanoke Island. And this I'll just mention briefly. I go into it in great detail in my book. It's a very exciting discovery that was made a few years ago. If you see you see the bottom left, you'll see the map, a close-up of that same map from the previous slide, and that little patch. And when they put this map in the British Museum on a light table, they discovered a fort underneath it. John White, the governor of the Lost Colony and the artist of the 1585 colony, had drawn a fort, and then he covered it up. Why? He covered it up because he did not want the Spanish to know. To know what? Well, that is the question that remains. Did the colonists build a fort at this point inland from Roanoke and then cover it up so the Spanish wouldn't get the map and find out? Well, these are questions that I go into, as I mentioned, in detail in my book. You'll see some of the artifacts that have been found that are English and possibly date to Elizabethan times. But we're going to move on because we have a little more history to cover. And this is another map that provides some really interesting information about the location of those colonists. So in 1590, John White goes back. The 100-odd colonists that he's left behind, including his daughter and granddaughter, Virginia Dare, first English child born in the New World, have vanished. And after that, the English don't send any other big expeditions to the New World for quite some time. There's a period when Elizabeth dies and James I becomes king, where there's not much that goes on. There are a few expeditions here and there, but nothing significant. And it's only in 1607 when John Smith and the other Jamestown colonists arrive in Chesapeake Bay, so 100 miles or so north of Roanoke, that they're able to get some data on what happened to those colonists. And again, I'm not going to go into great detail on this fascinating map. I actually went to the place where to see the original. It's in south of Valladolid, Spain, and this amazing castle that Philip II of Spain used as his archives. And it's still there. It's still a functioning archives. And they brought out this map for me to see. And what it is a map that John Smith made in 1607 or 1608. How did it end up in Spain? Well, to get across the point that maps are power, within months or even weeks of this map arriving in England, it got into the hands of the Spanish ambassador, Zuniga. And he then shipped it off to Philip II, and within a blink of an eye, this important intelligence was in the hands of the King of Spain. It just goes to show you that maps were really the center of intelligence operations back in the 16th and early 17th century. And there to your right, you'll see it's been written out in modern hand so you can read it. But these are some of the clues that John Smith received in speaking with Powhatan and other Algonquin-speaking Indians in Eastern Virginia when he asked them about their brethren who had settled 20 years before in Roanoke. Again, I won't go into detail, but another fascinating example how a map had important intelligence and was sought after by the Spanish, who were eager from the beginning to destroy the Roanoke colony as well as the Jamestown colony. So just briefly to talk about Jamestown. Jamestown had three missions. It was supposed to find gold or silver or iron or copper that could help feed England's growing industries. It was also supposed to find the lost colonists. What happened to those people? Now, there wasn't a great deal of concern, but it was a curiosity and also a practical curiosity. If the colonists were found, they might have established good relations with the locals and thereby help create trade networks for the English. Because the English were there not to take land from the Native Americans. The English were there to trade. They wanted to sell their goods to a new market. that was outside of Spain's control. And so these Native American Virginians were the perfect opportunity. But they also were looking for something else. They still were looking for that South Sea. I mean, as amazing as it might seem, Hacklett could never quite let go of the idea that there was this northern isthmus, this North American Panama. And he was still alive, actually, at this point in 1607. And his obsession, I would say, began to filter into the colonists who were arriving in Virginia. So the colonists were given the direction of actually looking for the East India Sea. And they were given the example of, well, you know, like the Volga River. So it's like that. You have to get over to the mountains, and then you'll find a river that will take you to the sea. And in 1621, this fascinating incident where a so-called China box was found by an Englishman on the Potomac, who was visiting the Potomac tribe. And the kings explained that, well, I got it from these people in the mountains who live to the southwest, and they got it from another nation beyond. Of course, this piqued the interest of the trader, who immediately assumed that this was a sign that China was just on the other side of the Appalachians. And the Virginia governor picked up on this, Yardley. He predicted that, quote, a most rich trade to Cathay, Japan, and those other of the East Indies was going to result. So this tells you that people were still fixated, even though they've been in Virginia now for a good 15 years, they still are focused on finding the mythical South Sea. So to wrap up, to my amazement, I discovered that this wasn't an idea that just faded after a few years in Jamestown. In fact, in the 1600s and into the 18th century, there were still attempts made to find the Pacific Ocean by crossing the Appalachians. 1654, 1666, 1716, famously, Governor Spotswood took a group of aristocrats with him on a jaunt across the Virginia Piedmont into the Appalachians. And part of the reason was to see if they could get information on the location of the Pacific. To the right, you'll see an image of the 300th anniversary of the Golden Horseshoe Expedition, as it was called. And even as late as 1756, a man named James Maury, who was of the famous Maury family, his an ancestor went on to lead the Confederate Navy, he believed that the Potomac, if you follow the Potomac to the Mississippi, you could get directly to the Pacific. So still, these ideas were floating around even 200 years plus after Verrazano. So I want to close with this one question. I was talking to an 11-year-old friend of mine recently, and we were hiking, and we came to a map of the hiking trail, and I stopped to look at it, as I always do when I see a map. And he said, oh yeah, there's Andrew looking at maps. Nobody looks at maps anymore. And for a moment, I felt a little outdated and irrelevant. And then just a week or so later, I encountered this story that I've just written a story about that'll appear, I believe, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. on the National Geographic website. And I'll give you just a quick little view of it. Essentially, it's a story about Native Americans who had an ancient capital on the James River, just about 50 miles or so northwest of Richmond, where the Virginia Library is. And the name of the place is Roanoke. Now, John Smith did this beautiful map, 1607 map that I showed you a little before. There you go, 1612 map, excuse me, that shows Virginia. And if you look at the upper left of the map, you'll see Monacans written across it. So what happened recently was a Virginia Water Authority wanted to build a water plant on this site. And the Native Americans, the Monacans, who just were given federal recognition a few years ago, they said, well, maybe. And then finally they did a little research, and they discovered that this was the site that they believed was their ancient capital. And part of the actually the main evidence for this is the map that John Smith did in 1612. You'll see here Roanoke is marked there clearly where a big river's coming in, which most historians agree is the Rivanna River. So this is where the Rivanna meets the James. It's a little point of land. It's very rural, and it seemed a perfect place to put a water plant, to pump water to these Virginia counties. But now the Monacans, ironically, the very people who avoided the Jamestown colonists, avoided Smith, would not allow them to come into their territory, and when they did, ignored them completely. These people today are able to draw on a map done by John Smith in 1612, which is very likely to allow them to save their ancient capital and force the water authority to put their pipeline elsewhere. So I think this is a really powerful sign that as much as we might think of maps as something to collect, like coins or some other material object, they also have this incredible value which suddenly can become quite relevant. So on that note, I want to take an opportunity to answer your questions and get a little dialogue going. Thank you very much for sitting through this. I know it's difficult on Zoom to maybe stay focused, but I hope we can have a little dialogue and find out what you have to say to me. So send in your questions now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, anyone. We'll give you a few seconds if you have any questions to type into the question box. That was a fantastic presentation, very fascinating. Thank you for doing it, and thank you for joining us this evening. Let me see, I have a few questions that were sent earlier on. Why don't I start with one from Kristen Ambrose? If your audience could only take away one thing from this lecture, what would you want it to be?
I think it would be that our country was founded on a geographical mistake.
All right. Here's another question. This one is from Charlotte Costner Blazer, and I apologize if I'm hurting anybody's names. What were the consequences of English, French, or other exploration into territory that had been claimed by Spain since the Treaty of Tordesillas? I can't pronounce anything correctly. 1492.
Good question. Well, the Spanish, of course, had locked up most of the Caribbean, as well as Florida and large parts of South America, if you include the Portuguese holdings. So as a result, the French and the English were left with very little territory south of that area. So inevitably, they began to look north. So the Chesapeake Bay or the Outer Banks area, from there north, the Spanish were uninterested because it was far from Panama, right? And there weren't much obvious advantages to that area. The Native Americans had very small settlements. They weren't large urban societies like the Aztec or like the Inca. And so the Spanish really weren't going to invest in it. So the French took the opportunity to focus on the area to the north around Quebec, going down the St. Lawrence Seaway and expanding down that way into the interior. And furs, of course, was what they found. The English, having come so late to the game, were really left with the area between, say, South Carolina, where the most northern Spanish settlement was, and northern New England, where the French were. So it's a pretty restricted zone where they were able to try and colonize an area that was, quote, not settled by any Christian prince, was the typical phrasing. So that's why they focused on that area. But also, I think what's been forgotten, and this is the point of my presentation, was that one of the reasons why they chose this area of the Outer Banks, which was actually a very poor choice, right? Because there's no good harbor. It's extremely dangerous. It's still called the graveyard of the Atlantic for very good reason. If you've ever tried to sail through Oregon Inlet, you know what I mean. It's one of the most treacherous waters, certainly on the East Coast, if not in the world. So it was not a good place to go. But the reason that they were focused on this from the beginning was because of this possibility that it would lead to the South Sea, to the Pacific Ocean. This is what made the English focus on this particular area in the 1580s. And then once they knew the area, it was natural for them to settle Jamestown, which was just a little bit to the north, because it was familiar territory.
Great. Sorry, they're typing these questions in as fast as I can read them. Do you know if there's ever been, and this one is from Vincent Pijot, do you know if there's ever been an archaeological survey or excavation at the Monacan capital site?
Good question. The Monacan capital site, or we'll just say Roanoke, Roanoke was excavated briefly in the 1930s and then again in the 1980s. These were not big excavations. They were fairly small, but in the 1980s, they did find Native American burials and woodland items, so clearly Native American artifacts. And there's no sign that says, you know, this is Roanoke. These were not literate people, but there is an incredible density of artifacts there, which most historians, including some of those who are the most adept at digging in Piedmont, Virginia, say without question shows it was a major site. Also, it was a place where two rivers met, and so it had a natural defenses, and it was well watered. So it was a great place to grow corn, squash, and beans. So all signs point to this little point of land, which is now called Point of Fork, as being Roanoke. I don't think there's any question about that. And the idea of more archaeological excavations, well, there was a small dig done in anticipation of this water plant being built. There was a lot of controversy about that dig because it was said that it was done by an unqualified archaeologist who hired unqualified workers, and that the dig was botched. In the future, it seems unlikely, even if the site is saved, that there will be much in the way of excavations. I talked to Chief Branham just yesterday, actually, and he said that his preference would be that landowners and the Army Corps of Engineers and the Water Authority agreed to donate or sell the land so that it could become a nature preserve. And maybe down the line there could be a dig, but it would have to be a dig that includes Native Americans who can take part, because there could well be graves. And if there are graves, then it requires great sensitivity.
All right. I think we have time for one more question, and I apologize if we don't get to everyone's. I will pass them along to you after tonight's presentation to see if you have any answers. But this one is from J.C. McElveen. Why does Smith's mapping of Virginia contain many Indian names and his New England mapping does not?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I can't say I know much about John Smith's foray to New England. I could come up with a theory. We know that he spent a good deal of time in Jamestown. He was there for quite some time before he had to leave after he was injured in an accident. And he got to know the language. He got to know the people. He became very, very close to Powhatan, to the leader, as well as to many other of the Algonquin speakers in the Powhatan Confederacy. So his intelligence network was quite extraordinary. At Roanoke, for example, we know it existed because he found Indian interlocutors who were able to tell him and obviously figure out how to show on a map where villages were. So he spent a lot of time and effort gathering this intelligence. I don't think he did that kind of deep learning when he was in New England. He was there relatively briefly, probably could speak some of the language because it's an Algonquin language, but it would have been more difficult. Didn't spend enough time and certainly didn't do the kind of travel that he did in Virginia. He spent so much time sailing up and down the Chesapeake Bay, going into the rivers, being captured and carted off to some new place that he would then put on a map. So, you know, he really had to put the time and effort into the map of Virginia, which I don't think he did for New England.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This has been a tremendous presentation. We really appreciate that you were able to join us. Thank you as well to everybody that attended this evening. As I said before, if you'd like to support the library, we've included the link in the chat box for this evening. We hope that you will consider that in joining the Fry-Jefferson Map Society as well, be a part of the library's work. Our next and final part of this year's Voorhees Lectures will take place on October 22nd with the Library of Virginia's senior map archivist, Cassandra Britt Farrell, presenting on 17th century maps of Virginia, Maryland, and the Southeast between 1590 and 1720. We'll put the link for registering for that program in the chat box as well. I'm sorry, we're probably overloading you with links this evening. Anyways, thank you again for the presentation. It was truly fantastic. Thank you everybody for attending, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thanks so much.